Every empire has a man they speak of only in whispers, a name that turns laughter to silence and bravery to calculation. In the frozen kingdom of Valadorn, that name belonged to Duke Cedric Ardenmore, and on the night his future bride arrived in chains disguised as jewels, even the winter wind seemed afraid to blow too hard against his walls. What happened next between the most feared ruler in the north and the one woman who looked straight through his armor without flinching? That is a story worth staying for, every single moment of it, because it will change the way you understand what power actually costs. The execution took place at dawn, and Caedric watched every second of it. Lord Edric Vale knelt on the frost-blackened stone of the Capitol Square, with his wrists bound behind his back and his neck already bowed before the headsman's blade caught the first gray light. Snow drifted sideways across the platform. The gathered crowd stood in columns of rigid silence, not because the spectacle demanded reverence, but because the Duke of Blackthorn occupied the northern balcony above them, and no one in Valadorn had survived the mistake of drawing his attention during moments he considered sacred. Caedric did not flinch when the blade fell. He did not look away. He stood with his gloved hands resting on the iron railing, his black coat absorbing the pale winter light, until he looked less like a man and more like a fracture in the morning itself. Beside him, his steward Aldrich kept his gaze fixed on the cobblestones 3 stories below, unwilling to witness either the death or the expression on his master's face during it. "The daughter," Cedric said. Aldrich swallowed. "She arrives tonight, Your Grace. The king's escort departed the capital at midnight." "Tonight." Cedric repeated the word as if tasting something he had not yet decided to swallow. His eyes remained on the square below, where servants were already removing the body with the mechanical efficiency that attended all state functions in Valadorn. Blood steamed against frozen stone. The crowd had not moved. And the terms remain unchanged. Betrothal within the fortnight, union before spring. The Vale territories fold into Blackthorn governance upon consummation of the marriage. Aldrich recited the terms from memory because he had read the royal decree 11 times since its arrival, and still could not believe the king had been foolish enough to sign it. "She becomes your property in all but title, Your Grace." Cedric turned from the railing. The movement was unhurried, controlled, the way predators shifted direction when they had already decided the chase was unnecessary. His face carried the kind of stillness that made lesser men confess to crimes they had not committed. Dark hair cut severe against a jaw that could have been carved from the same obsidian as his fortress walls. Eyes the color of winter steel, holding no warmth and offering no invitation to search for any. "She becomes my duchess," he corrected quietly. "There is a difference." Aldrich did not ask what difference. He had served Caedric Ardenmore for 14 years and understood that questions were a luxury the Duke rarely extended and never tolerated twice. Blackthorn Keep announced itself long before visitors reached its gates. The fortress sprawled across the northern cliffs like a wound that had healed wrong, all sharp angles and vertical stone faces dropping into the churning gray sea below. Iron spires clawed upward into permanent overcast skies. The windows were narrow and deep-set, designed centuries ago not for beauty, but for the precise purpose of making arrows fly outward while keeping everything dangerous from entering. The architecture itself was a philosophy. Survival required making yourself harder than the world trying to kill you. Inside, the keep operated with suffocating precision. Servants moved through corridors of polished black stone in practiced silence. Meals appeared and vanished at exact intervals. The household ran not on loyalty, but on the understanding that disorder invited consequences no one in Blackthorn wished to experience firsthand. Cedric had inherited this system from his father, Duke Aldrin Ardenmore, a man whose educational methods had included locking his 7-year-old heir inside the keep's underground vaults for 3 days to teach him that darkness was not something to fear, but something to become. The lesson had worked. By the time Caedric assumed the title at 21, 3 noble houses had already fallen trying to test his resolve. By 25, the northern territories operated under a silence so complete that merchants from the southern kingdoms called it peace. It was not peace. It was the absence of anyone left willing to fight. Now 32, the Duke of Blackthorn controlled more territory than any noble outside the royal bloodline. His wealth funded armies. His trade routes fed kingdoms. His name appeared in diplomatic correspondence the way weather appeared in farmers' almanacs, as a force no one pretended to control, but everyone adjusted their lives around. And tonight, a dead man's daughter would walk through his gates, wearing the crown's promise that she belonged to him. The escort arrived after dark. Cedric had ordered the great hall lit for the occasion, though his definition of ceremony carried a different weight than most men's. Iron chandeliers burned low above the long stone gallery. Torchlight crawled across walls hung with the banners of every house that had bent to Ardmore authority over the last century. Some willingly, most not. The hall was designed to communicate a single message to anyone entering it for the first time. You are small here, and whatever you were before you walked through that door no longer applies. Cedric stood at the far end of the gallery beside the great hearth, positioned so that anyone entering would have to cross 40 yards of open stone floor under his observation before reaching him. It was a tactic his father had perfected. Make them walk to you. Make them feel every step. The doors opened. 6 royal guards entered first, their ceremonial armor catching torchlight in disciplined flashes. Behind them walked 2 court ladies with their gazes lowered and their hands folded in matching postures of performative submission. Behind them walked a woman who looked nothing like a hostage and nothing like a bride and nothing like anyone Cedric Ardmore had prepared himself to meet. Lady Seraphina Vale crossed the threshold of Blackthorn's great hall in a gown of silver velvet with frost still melting along the hem of her traveling cloak. Her dark hair was pulled back from a face built on contradictions. Soft mouth, sharp jaw, eyes the color of aged whiskey, that carried an intelligence so immediate it functioned almost like aggression. She was beautiful in the specific way that made political rooms dangerous, the kind of beauty that rearranged men's priorities without asking permission. But what stopped Cedric's breath was not her beauty. It was the fact that she did not lower her eyes. Every person in that hall, guards, servants, court attendants, had reflexively dropped their gaze the moment they entered Blackthorn's gallery. It was not obedience. It was biology. Something about the architecture, the atmosphere, the invisible pressure of Cedric's authority saturating the air itself triggered the survival instinct that told human beings to make themselves smaller in the presence of apex predators. Seraphina looked directly at him, not with defiance exactly, not with challenge, with something worse, assessment. She looked at him the way a woman studied a lock she intended to understand before deciding whether to pick it or walk away from the door entirely. Cedric felt something shift behind his sternum. Not warmth, something closer to a crack forming in frozen ground. Lady Vale. His voice carried across the hall without effort, the acoustic precision of the gallery turning even quiet speech into something inescapable. Blackthorn welcomes you. She stopped 12 yards from the hearth, not the full 40-yard walk, not where he had positioned himself to receive her. 12 yards, the exact distance that communicated neither submission nor open hostility. It was a calculated choice, and the fact that she had made it within seconds of entering a room designed to strip calculation from its visitors told him more about Seraphina Vale than any intelligence report ever could. Your Grace, she said. Her voice was steady, low, the kind of voice that did not need volume to command attention. I understand I am here because your king requires it. Our king, Cedric corrected. Yours. A pause. Mine died this morning on a platform he should never have stood on. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, the way a drawn bowstring was loaded. Every servant in the gallery went motionless. Aldrich, standing 3 steps behind the Duke, stopped breathing altogether. In 32 years, no one had ever spoken to Cedric Ardmore with that kind of quiet precision in his own hall, and lived to see the meal that followed. Cedric studied her. The firelight moved across the silver velvet of her gown and caught the edge of her jaw and made her look like something forged rather than born. A woman built by grief into a shape that no longer fit comfortable categories. Your father was convicted of treason, he said. My father was murdered. She did not blink. And I was sold to the man who stood on the balcony and watched. The crack behind Cedric's sternum widened. He crushed it the way he crushed everything that threatened his internal architecture, with absolute stillness and the reminder that sentiment was a weapon only when someone else held it. "You will be shown to your quarters," he said evenly. "We will speak again at dinner." "Will we?" It was not a question. She turned before he dismissed her. That alone was an act so far outside protocol that one of the royal guards took a half step forward before Aldrich's sharp glance froze him in place. Serafina Vale walked out of the great hall with the same measured stride she had entered it, never once looking back, and the sound of her footsteps echoed against obsidian walls long after she vanished into the corridor beyond. Cedric stood motionless beside the fire for nearly a full minute after she left. "Your Grace," Aldrich ventured carefully. "Clear the hall." The steward did not hesitate. Within 60 seconds, the gallery was empty except for the Duke and the sound of burning timber settling in the hearth. Cedric pressed both palms against the mantelpiece and leaned forward until the heat from the flames touched his face. He had conquered lords. He had broken alliances. He had ordered executions with the same emotional detachment that other men used to select wine at dinner. None of it, not one moment in his entire career of methodical dominion, had prepared him for a woman who stood in the center of his power and made it feel temporary. He did not understand the sensation moving through him. That was the most dangerous part. Cedric Ardenmore had built his entire existence on understanding, controlling, predicting. Emotion was architecture, fear was a floor plan. Even cruelty served structural purpose. Whatever Serafina Vale had just detonated inside his chest had no blueprint. Dinner was a disaster dressed in candlelight and protocol. The long table in Blackthorn's formal dining chamber seated 24, though only 7 chairs were occupied. Cedric at the head. Serafina to his right, where tradition placed the betrothed. Aldrich at the far end managing household matters between courses. 4 minor nobles from neighboring estates who had accepted the Duke's invitation because refusing it was something that happened only in stories about men who used to be alive. Serafina had changed into dark emerald silk, and the color turned her skin luminous against the iron and stone backdrop of the dining hall. She ate with precise, unhurried movements that suggested aristocratic training so deep it had become muscle memory rather than performance. She answered questions when addressed. She smiled when courtesy required it. And underneath every perfectly calibrated social gesture, Cedric sensed something coiled and waiting. Lord Mercer, a barrel-chested man who governed a modest province east of Blackthorn, made the mistake of testing the waters first. "Lady Vale, you must be relieved," Mercer said between bites of roasted pheasant. "Your father's circumstances were unfortunate, but a match with House Ardenmore is the kind of fortune most families would bleed for." The table went quiet. Serafina set down her fork. The movement was gentle, deliberate. The softness of it carried more threat than any blade. "Lord Mercer," she said, "you govern the Eastmere province. 4,000 souls, if the last census was accurate. Your granaries ran short 2 winters ago, and 47 people died of starvation in villages under your direct authority." She paused long enough for the color to drain from Mercer's face. "I would be careful using the word unfortunate so casually. You seem to have a limited understanding of its weight." Mercer opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for his wine with a hand that was not entirely steady. Cedric watched the exchange without expression. Beneath the table, his left hand had tightened around the arm of his chair hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Not from anger, from something far more destabilizing. A part of him, the part that still lived in the vault his father had locked him inside. The part that had learned to calculate threat before it learned to calculate kindness, recognized what Serafina had just done with surgical clarity. She had established dominance at his table using nothing but truth and timing. He wanted to destroy her for it. He wanted to watch her do it again. The contradiction lived inside him like a blade turning slowly between his ribs, and for the first time in his adult life, Cedric did not know which instinct to obey. The days that followed were warfare without declaration. Serafina moved through Blackthorn Keep as if she had been born inside its walls and simply returned after a long absence. She memorized corridors within hours. She learned the names of servants that Cedric had never bothered to know existed. She appeared in the kitchens and the stables and the archive rooms with the quiet authority of someone cataloging a territory she intended to understand before she decided what to do with it. She questioned everything. When Cedric's captain of the guard flogged a stable boy for stealing bread, Serafina appeared in the courtyard before the third lash fell. "Stop!" The captain looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. He turned to Kadric, who stood on the upper gallery watching with his arms crossed. "The boy stole," the captain said. "The boy is 11 years old and his ribs are visible through his shirt," Serafina replied. Her voice did not waver. "If a child steals bread in a fortress that wastes enough food to feed 3 villages, the theft is not his crime. It is yours." The courtyard went silent. 20 guards. A dozen servants pressed against doorways trying to disappear. The captain's whip hand hung frozen in mid-swing, waiting for the Duke's command the way a hunting dog waited for the signal to lunge. Kadric stared down at her from the gallery. The morning light hit the side of her face and turned her into something that belonged in a painting rather than an argument about a starving boy. She stared back at him with those amber eyes full of something he could only describe as the opposite of fear. "Release the boy," Kadric said. The captain blinked. "Your Grace, did I stutter?" The boy was released. The captain holstered his whip with a rigidity that said more than any protest. Serafina watched the child disappear into the kitchens before she looked up at Kadric once more. She did not thank him. She did not smile. She gave him a single nod, the kind of acknowledgement one gave an equal who had made the correct decision, and then she walked back inside without another word. That night, Kadric sat alone in his study with maps spread across the table and a glass of whiskey he had not touched. The fire had burned to embers. The room was dark except for the glow that remained, painting his shadow long and angular against the stone wall behind him. He was thinking about the vault. 3 days. 7 years old. No food, no light, no sound except the rats moving through the darkness and the echo of his own breathing bouncing off walls he could not see. His father had opened the door on the 4th morning and looked down at the boy sitting in his own filth with dry eyes and clenched fists and said, "Now you understand what the world does to men who expect kindness." Kadric had never forgotten the lesson. He had transformed it into governance, into architecture, into the specific brand of control that made Blackthorn the most feared territory in Valadorn. Every decision he made carried the vault inside it, the absolute certainty that softness was a structural failure, that mercy was a door left unlocked for enemies to walk through, that the only safety available in a world built on predation was becoming the thing everything else was afraid of. And now a woman he had known for less than a week was rearranging the furniture inside his head without asking permission. He drank the whiskey in one swallow and poured another. "You are making a mistake, Your Grace." Kadric did not look up when Aldrich entered the study 3 days later. The steward placed a leather folio on the desk containing intelligence reports from the capital and stood at attention with the posture of a man delivering news he expected to be punished for. "The household is talking," Aldrich continued carefully. "Lady Vale countermanded 3 disciplinary orders this week. She redirected grain shipments from the eastern stores to 2 border villages without authorization. She has been meeting privately with your senior household staff and asking questions about keep operations that are, frankly, Your Grace, above her station." Kadric turned a page in the folio. And the noble houses are watching." Aldrich lowered his voice. "Lord Cassian Verlick sent a representative to the capital last week. The official purpose was trade negotiation. The actual purpose, according to our sources, was a private audience with 3 members of the King's Council." Now Kadric looked up. Cassian Verlick. The name tasted like iron and old blood. The Verlick family had contested Ardenmoor dominance for 2 generations. Cassian himself was a diplomat's son with a strategist's mind and a killer's patience, the kind of enemy who never attacked until the architecture of your defeat was already complete before you noticed the first crack. What does Verlick want? What he has always wanted, Blackthorn. But now he has something he has never had before. Aldrich paused. "A narrative. The court is whispering that the Duke of Blackthorn has lost control of his own household, that a hostage bride wanders your keep giving orders while you watch from the gallery like a man who has forgotten how to speak." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either violence or decisions that changed the shape of nations. Kadric sat motionless in his chair, his face carved from shadow and firelight, and when he finally spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Bring her to me. They found Serafina in the library. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor between shelves of leather-bound volumes with a territorial map spread across her lap and ink stains on her fingers. She looked up when Aldrich appeared in the doorway and studied his expression with the same quick calibration she applied to everything in Blackthorn. "The Duke requests your presence in his private study," Aldrich said. "Requests." Immediately. She closed the map, stood, brushed dust from her skirt with the unhurried precision that Cadric would have recognized as a tactical choice. Never let anyone see you rush toward their summons. When she entered the study, Cadric was standing beside the window with his back to the door. The room was smaller than the Great Hall, more personal. Bookshelves lined 3 walls. A heavy desk dominated the center. The window looked out over the northern cliffs where the sea battered itself against rocks that had been old when the Ardenmoor bloodline was still young. He did not turn around when she entered. "Close the door." She did. A long moment passed. The sound of the sea filled the space between them like a third presence, ancient and indifferent. "You have been busy," Cadric said. "I have been useful. There is a difference." He turned. The light from the window cut across half his face and left the other half in shadow, and the effect made him look exactly like what he was. A man divided between what power had made him and what something else was trying to unmake. "You redirected my grain stores. Your eastern reserves were rotting in warehouses while 2 villages starved within a day's ride. That is not governance. That is vanity. You countermanded my captain's authority. Your captain beat a child for hunger. That is not authority. That is cowardice. You have been interrogating my staff. I have been learning the names of people who keep your house standing while you pretend they do not exist." She paused. "Would you like me to continue, or would you prefer to tell me what this is actually about?" Cadric closed the distance between them in 3 strides, not touching her, not threatening, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, close enough that the scent of cold iron and wood smoke filled the space between their bodies. "This is about the fact that you are not a duchess yet," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "This is about the fact that you are a guest in my keep under my authority, by my king's command, and you walk through my halls as if you own the ground beneath them." Serafina did not step back. She tilted her chin upward and met his gaze from a distance that would have made most humans stop breathing. "And this is about the fact that you could have stopped me at any time," she said. "You could have locked me in my chambers, stripped my privileges, had me removed from Blackthorn entirely. The king's decree gives you the authority. Your reputation gives you the precedent." Her voice softened, not with fear, but with something that resembled understanding. "But you did not, and that terrifies you more than anything Cassian Verlick could ever do." The silence between them was a living thing. It had weight, it had teeth. Cadric stared at her the way a man stared at a fire that had already burned past the boundaries he set for it, knowing that the only options left were to let it consume everything or suffocate it completely, and lose the only warmth he had felt in years. "You do not know what you are doing," he said. "I know exactly what I am doing." Her eyes held something he did not have a name for. "The question is whether you do." He turned away from her, walked back to the window, pressed his hand against the cold glass, and watched the black sea churn below the cliffs, while something inside his chest rearranged itself into a configuration he did not recognize and could not control. "Leave," he said. She left. And the moment the door closed behind her, Cedric Ardenmoor, the most feared man in Valadorn, the Duke who had broken armies and silenced kingdoms, brought his fist down against the window frame hard enough to split the skin across his knuckles, and stood there bleeding while the winter sea roared beneath him and the walls of Blackthorn Keep felt, for the first time in his life, like they were not thick enough to protect him from what was already inside. 2 days later, a sealed letter arrived from the capital bearing Cassian Verlick's personal cipher. Aldrich brought it to Cadric's desk with the expression of a man handing someone a lit fuse. Cadric broke the seal, read the contents, read them again. Then he set the letter down with the careful precision of a man placing a weapon on a table and looked at Aldrich with an expression his steward had never seen before. Not rage, not calculation, but something cold and vast and trembling at the edges like ice the moment before it shatters. Verlick has proof, Cadric said quietly. Proof of what, Your Grace? That Edric Vale never committed treason, a pause that seemed to swallow the firelight, and that I was the one they used to make sure he died for it anyway. The letter sat on the desk between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled, and somewhere in the library, 2 corridors away, Seraphina Vale turned a page in her father's old journal, without knowing that the man she had been ordered to marry had just discovered the one truth capable of destroying them both. The letter burned a hole through the desk without leaving a mark. Kedrick read it a 3rd time, though the words had already carved themselves into the inside of his skull with the permanence of a scar. Cassian Verlick's handwriting was elegant, unhurried, the penmanship of a man who understood that the most devastating weapons were delivered gently. Every line was constructed with diplomatic precision and laced with the kind of poison that did not kill immediately, but rotted the architecture from inside until the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. The evidence was meticulous. Dates, names, transaction records from the royal treasury showing payments made to 3 members of the King's Council in the months preceding Lord Edric Vale's arrest. Testimony from a palace clerk who had since disappeared. And at the center of it all, a single damning detail that Cadric had never known. Edric Vale had not been investigating treason. He had uncovered it. He had discovered that Cassian Verlick and a faction within the King's own advisory circle were engineering the slow dismantlement of the northern power structure, redirecting military resources, destabilizing border alliances, and positioning Verlick's coalition to absorb the territories that would inevitably fracture once the balance collapsed. Vale had tried to warn the Crown. The Crown had killed him for it. And Cadric Ardenmore, the Duke who prided himself on seeing every threat, calculating every angle, controlling every variable within the vast machinery of Valadorn's political landscape, had stood on that balcony and watched the one man trying to prevent catastrophe die on his knees in the snow. Not because Cadric had ordered it, but because he had not questioned it, because the intelligence reports crossing his desk had told him Vale was guilty, and he had accepted that conclusion with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to everything, because questioning the system meant questioning the foundation he had built his entire identity on top of, and foundations were not something Cadric Ardenmore examined. They were something he stood on while other men sank. Aldrich had not moved from the doorway. The steward's face held the particular shade of gray that appeared when a man realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. "How much of this is verified?" Cadric said. "I cannot confirm without independent—" "How much?" Aldrich exhaled. "The Treasury records match discrepancies our own auditors flagged 6 months ago. The names correspond to known Verlick associates. The clerk referenced in the letter was reported missing from the Capital Registrar's office 3 weeks after Vale's execution." He paused. "If this is fabricated, it is the most sophisticated forgery I have encountered in 14 years of intelligence work." Kedrick set the letter down. His hands were steady, his breathing was controlled. Every external signal indicated the same granite composure that had made him the most feared negotiator in the kingdom. But Aldrich had spent enough years reading the Duke's silences to recognize when the stillness was not calm, but containment. The rigid architecture of a man holding something volatile inside a space too small to hold it safely. "Verlick sent this to me," Cadric said. "Not to the court, not to the public record. To me, personally, using his own cipher." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" Aldrich understood the question was not casual, it was structural. Cadric did not ask why the way other men asked why. He asked it the way engineers asked why a load-bearing wall had cracked, not from curiosity, but because the answer determined whether the building was still standing. "Because the information itself is not the weapon," Aldrich said carefully. "Giving it to you is the weapon. He wants you to know that he knows. He wants you to understand that he controls the narrative of your complicity in an innocent man's death, and that he can release that narrative at any moment of his choosing." Leverage. "The most elegant kind. He does not need to use it. He only needs you to know it exists." Cadric stood. The chair scraped against stone with a sound like a blade being drawn. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass, and the cold hit his skin like a correction. Sharp, immediate, useful. Below, the sea continued its ancient violence against the cliffs, indifferent to the political demolition happening 300 feet above it. He had built Blackthorn on certainty, on the absolute conviction that his judgment was architecture and his decisions were structural. Remove that conviction and the entire fortress was nothing but stones stacked on sand. "Does she know?" he said. "Lady Vale? Does she know her father was innocent?" Aldrich hesitated. "I cannot determine. Find out." Cadric turned from the window. His eyes carried something Aldrich had never seen in them before. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The look of a man who had just realized the monster he had been fighting was standing in his own mirror. "Find out without her knowing you are looking, and bring me everything we have on Verlick's movements for the last 2 years. Everything. I want supply routes, correspondence, garrison deployments, every handshake he made with anyone above the rank of merchant." "And the letter itself?" Cadric looked at the parchment on his desk. In another life, the life he had been living 40 minutes ago, he would have burned it. Destroying evidence was reflex, control the information, control the outcome. That was the lesson his father had beaten into him, alongside the darkness and the rats, and the understanding that survival meant becoming harder than anything trying to break you. But burning the letter meant burying the truth about Edric Vale. And burying that truth meant looking Seraphina in the eyes every day across his dinner table, knowing he was sitting on her father's unmarked grave. "Lock it in my private vault," he said. "No copies, no record of its existence." Aldrich nodded and reached for the letter. "And Aldrich, Your Grace, if Verlick contacts me again through any channel, I want to know before the seal is broken." The steward gathered the letter with the delicacy of a man handling a live explosive and left the study without another word. Cadric stood alone in the darkening room and listened to the fire die and felt the walls of Blackthorn press inward with a weight they had never carried before. He found Seraphina in the east corridor the following morning, standing before a window that overlooked the inner courtyard where servants were unloading grain from the shipments she had redirected without his authorization. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and the morning light caught her face at an angle that made the amber in her eyes burn like something geological, like light trapped inside stone for centuries finally finding a crack to escape through. "You are up early," she said. "I did not sleep." She studied him. The assessment was instant and thorough, the way she processed everything, cataloging details the way a general cataloged terrain. Whatever she saw in his face made her expression shift from guarded neutrality to something narrower, more focused. Something happened. It was not a question. Edric filed that observation the way he filed all information about Seraphina Vale, reluctantly and with the growing awareness that his filing system was no longer adequate for the material. "Walk with me," he said. They moved through the east wing in silence, past the armory, past the servants' quarters, through a narrow passage that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking the northern cliffs. The wind hit them immediately, cold and salt-heavy, carrying the sound of waves detonating against rock 300 feet below. It was the most exposed position in Blackthorn, visible from nowhere inside the keep, audible to nothing except the sea. Cadric had used this terrace exactly once before to deliver a message to a spy he had later executed. It was the only place in the fortress where he was certain no one could listen. Seraphina pulled her cloak tighter against the wind and waited. She did not ask why he had brought her here. She did not fill the silence with nervous conversation. She waited with the patience of a woman who understood that the most important words were the ones people needed time to find. "Your father," Cadric said. The wind nearly swallowed the words. "Tell me what you know about the charges against him." Something changed in her face. Not softening, hardening. The way metal hardened when you heated it past its tolerance and then cooled it too fast. "I know they were a lie." "How?" "Because I knew my father." Her voice was flat, not emotional. Controlled in the specific way that indicated emotion was present, but had been locked inside a structure built to contain it. Edric Vale served the crown for 31 years. He refused bribes from 4 different noble houses. He reported corruption in the Southern Trade Commission when staying silent would have tripled his estate income. He was the most inconveniently honest man in Valadorn, and that is exactly why they killed him. Cadric absorbed this without visible reaction. The wind pulled at his coat, his hair, the edges of composure he had spent 32 years constructing. "You said they," he said. "Who?" "You are asking me questions you already know the answers to." "I am asking you questions I want to hear you answer." She turned to face him fully. The wind pressed her dark hair against the side of her face, and in the gray northern light she looked less like a noblewoman and more like something the cliffs themselves had produced. Angular, weathered, unbreakable in ways that had nothing to do with softness or its absence. "Cassian Verlick," she said, "and whoever inside the Crown's council, Verlick owns. My father found something. I do not know exactly what. His last letter to me arrived 2 weeks before the arrest, and all it said was that the North was in danger and that the threat was not coming from outside. It was coming from inside the system itself." She paused. "He asked me to protect myself. He did not ask me to protect him. That is how I knew he had already accepted he was going to die." Kedrick felt the words land inside his chest like stones dropping into deep water. Each one sank further than the last. Each one displaced something that had been settled for years. "And me," he said quietly. "Where do I fall in your theory?" Serafina looked at him for a long time. The sea roared beneath them. The wind screamed across the terrace with the kind of force that made standing upright feel like a decision rather than a default. "I have not decided yet," she said. "That is not an answer. It is the most honest one I have." She stepped closer. Not from affection, from the same instinct that drove her to close distance in arguments, making retreat impossible for both parties. "You stood on that balcony and watched my father die. I saw the reports. You were there. So either you knew the charges were fabricated and you let an innocent man's blood soak into the stone because it served your interests, or you did not know, and the great Duke of Blackthorn, sir, the man who sees everything, controls everything, misses nothing, was played like a puppet by the same people who murdered my father." The silence between them was brutal. It stripped away every layer of diplomatic language and political maneuvering and left nothing but two people standing on a cliff above a freezing sea with a dead man's ghost occupying the space between their bodies. "Which possibility frightens you more?" she said. Kedrick did not answer. Not because he lacked the words, but because both answers led to the same destination. A version of himself he had never been forced to confront. A crack in the foundation that went all the way down to the bedrock of who he had decided to be when he was 7 years old, sitting in the dark, learning to become something that darkness itself would respect. "I did not know," he said. 3 words. They cost him more than any military campaign, more than any execution order, more than every calculated act of cruelty he had performed in the name of maintaining the architecture of control that kept him standing upright in a world designed to break men who hesitated. Serafina's expression did not change, but her breathing did. One fractional shift in rhythm, barely detectable, the kind of involuntary response that the body produced when the mind encountered something it had not prepared for. "And now," she said, "now I know." "What does that change?" "Everything." He met her gaze. "Or nothing, depending on what I do next." She searched his face with the intensity of a woman reading a document that might save her or condemn her. And Kedrick stood inside that examination without flinching, because flinching was something he had unlearned decades ago, even when the examination in question was cutting through defenses that no army had ever breached. "My father kept records," she said, "journals, correspondence. He was meticulous about documentation because he trusted systems more than people." A pause. "If any of those records survived the arrest, they would contain the evidence he gathered against Verlick, the original evidence, not Verlick's curated version." "Where?" "The Vale estate was seized by the Crown after the execution. The official inventory listed the contents as unremarkable, but my father built a concealed archive beneath his study that only 3 people knew about: himself, my mother, who died when I was 12, and me." Kedrick processed this. Concealed archives, original evidence, a paper trail that could expose Verlick's conspiracy, vindicate Edric Vale's name, and simultaneously detonate the political foundation of every alliance Kedrick had maintained for the last decade by revealing that the Crown's justice system was compromised at the highest level. The strategic calculus was staggering. Retrieving those documents meant moving against the crown's authority over the seized estate. It meant revealing that he, Cadric, had reason to question the official treason verdict. It meant aligning himself, however temporarily, with the daughter of a man the entire kingdom believed was a traitor. Every ally he had cultivated through fear and dominance would view that alignment as weakness. Every enemy would view it as opportunity. And Verlic would view it as exactly the provocation he needed to activate whatever secondary strategy was waiting behind the elegant handwriting and the personal cipher and the devastating patience of a man who delivered weapons disguised as information. "The estate is 3 days' ride from Blackthorn," Cadric said. "2 if you do not bring an army." "I was not planning to bring an army." "You were not planning to go at all." She tilted her head. "You were planning to send men, keep distance, maintain control of the operation without exposing yourself to the risk." She was right. The realization that she could predict his tactical instincts with that level of accuracy produced a sensation in Kedric's chest that was half admiration and half alarm. "And your alternative," he said. "I go with you. 2 riders. No escort. No banners. If Verlic has informants watching the estate, a full Ardenmoor deployment would signal exactly what we are looking for. 2 riders moving through the northern passes in winter are invisible. You are asking me to leave Blackthorn unguarded. I'm asking you to stop governing like a man inside a vault." Her voice dropped. "The walls kept you safe when you were 7. They are killing you now." The words hit him below the architecture, below the strategy, below every constructed layer of identity and governance and controlled brutality that constituted the operational machinery of Duke Cadric Ardenmoor. They hit him in the place where a 7-year-old boy had once sat in perfect darkness and decided that the only way to survive was to become the thing that locked the door. He looked at her standing on the edge of his fortress, with the wind tearing at her hair and the sea roaring below them like the sound of every decision he had ever avoided catching up to him at once. And he understood with absolute clarity that this woman was going to destroy the version of himself he had spent 25 years building. The terrifying part was that he was no longer certain that version deserved to survive. Aldrich intercepted them in the main corridor 20 minutes later with a face that suggested the intelligence reports had yielded results no one wanted. "Your Grace, we have a problem." "When do we not?" Aldrich glanced at Serafina. The look carried a question Cadric answered by not answering it. The steward understood that her presence was no longer a variable being managed. It was a condition being accepted. "Verlic's representative in the capital did not leave after the trade negotiation," Aldrich said. "He has taken permanent residence in the diplomatic quarter. Our sources confirm he has met privately with Lord Mercer, Lady Ashworth, and Baron Hale within the last 6 days." Cadric stopped walking. "Mercer was at my table 4 days ago." "Yes, Your Grace. Eating my food, drinking my wine, sitting 12 feet from me and smiling." "Yes." The silence that followed was the kind that made experienced soldiers check their exits. Serafina observed the Duke's face shift through something rapid and controlled, the surface remaining perfectly still while the geology beneath it rearranged itself into a new and more dangerous configuration. "Ashworth controls the southern pass," Cadric said. "Hale controls the river garrisons. Mercer controls the eastern grain supply." He turned to Aldrich. "That is not a political coalition. That is a siege perimeter." "I reached the same conclusion, Your Grace." "How long?" "Based on the coordination timeline, I estimate Verlic has been building this for at least 18 months, possibly longer. The letter was not the opening move. It was the announcement that the game is already in progress." Cadric looked at Serafina. She was already processing the information, her eyes moving rapidly the way they did when she was constructing tactical models from incomplete data. "He waited," she said. "He waited until I was inside Blackthorn, until the betrothal was announced, until you were politically committed to a marriage that half the kingdom already views as conquest rather than union." She met Cadric's gaze. "I am not just a hostage. I am the detonator. My presence here gives Verlic the narrative he needs. The ruthless duke who seized a dead traitor's daughter as a trophy while his allies build the cage around him." Charming assessment. Accurate assessment. She did not flinch. "And it means that whatever we do about my father's documents, We do it now, before Verlick finishes closing the perimeter, before Mercer and Ashworth and Hale commit publicly to whatever Verlick has promised them. Because once that coalition announces itself, your choice is reduced to two: submit or fight. And if you fight without evidence of Verlick's conspiracy, you fight as the villain in someone else's story. Kaedric stared at her. The corridor was empty. Torchlight moved across the obsidian walls in slow, patient waves. Somewhere deeper in the keep, servants continued their routines in the blind confidence that the world above them was still being managed by the iron will of a man who never miscalculated. 3 days, he said to Aldrich. I want provisioned horses in the east stable before dawn. Cold weather gear. No banners, no escort. If anyone asks, I am conducting a private inspection of the northern border installations. Aldrich's expression suggested he was composing his resignation letter internally. Your Grace, leaving Blackthorn at this moment is necessary, strategically inadvisable in the extreme. Noted. Kaedric's voice closed the discussion with the finality of a vault door slamming shut. You will manage the keep in my absence. No audiences. No correspondence. If Verlick sends another letter, you hold it sealed until I return. If Mercer or any of his new friends request entry to Blackthorn, you tell them the Duke is indisposed and they can put their requests in writing. And if they do not accept that, then they reveal themselves faster than Verlick intended, and we learn something useful from their impatience. Aldrich looked at Seraphina one more time. Whatever he saw in her face, determination, calculation, the specific kind of stubbornness that could not be managed by conventional authority, seemed to settle something inside him. Not comfort, resignation. The quiet acceptance of a man who understood that the storm coming could not be stopped, only navigated. I will have the horses ready by 4th watch, he said, and left. Kaedric and Seraphina stood alone in the corridor. The torch nearest them guttered in an unseen draft, sending shadows crawling across the floor between their feet. You understand what happens if we find those documents, Kaedric said. We expose Verlick. We expose everything, including the Crown's role in your father's death, including the fact that the kingdom's justice system was weaponized against an innocent man, while every ruling family in Valadorn, including mine, accepted the verdict without question because questioning it would have been inconvenient. He held her gaze. Including me. Especially you. And you still want to go. My father died for the truth. Her voice carried something raw beneath the control, something that had been waiting behind the composed exterior since the moment she walked into Blackthorn's great hall and refused to lower her eyes. The least I can do is make sure the truth survives him. Kaedric nodded once. It was the smallest gesture he was capable of making, and it committed him to a course of action that would either vindicate him or incinerate everything he had spent his life constructing. He turned and walked toward his quarters without another word. Behind him, Seraphina remained in the corridor alone, her hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall of Blackthorn Keep. She stood there until the torchlight steadied and the Duke's footsteps faded into silence. And then she closed her eyes and allowed herself 3 seconds of the fear she had been refusing to show since the moment she arrived at this fortress. Fear not of Kaedric Ardenmore, not of Verlick's conspiracy, not of the political annihilation waiting at the end of this road, but of the thing she had seen behind the Duke's eyes when he said, I did not know. Honesty. Unstructured. Uncontrolled. The kind of honesty that only escaped from people whose entire architecture was failing, and the ruins had not yet settled enough to reveal what was still standing underneath. She opened her eyes. Straightened. Let the mask slide back into place with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been performing composure since the day she watched her father's name appear on an execution warrant. And then she walked back toward the library to retrieve the one document she had not told Kaedric about, the final letter her father had written the night before he died, sealed in wax stamped with the Vale family crest, addressed to no one, containing a list of names that would set the entire kingdom on fire the moment anyone read it aloud. They rode out of Blackthorn before the sun broke the horizon, 2 dark shapes moving against a landscape that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated warmth. The northern passes carved through granite ridgelines blanketed in ice so thick it turned the rock blue-black beneath the surface. Wind screamed through the narrow corridors between cliff faces with a sound that resembled something dying slowly and refusing to stay quiet about it. The horses kept their heads low and their hooves careful on frozen trails that disappeared and reformed with every gust. Kedrick rode in front. Serafina rode 3 lengths behind, not because protocol demanded it, but because the trail was too narrow for anything else, and she had chosen the position before he could assign it. Even in the simple geometry of 2 riders crossing hostile terrain, she made decisions before he could convert them into orders. It was becoming a pattern he no longer had the energy to resent. They did not speak for the first 4 hours. The cold made conversation dangerous. Each breath a theft of heat the body could not spare, and the terrain demanded focus that left no room for the kind of words sitting between them like unexploded ordnance. Kedrick used the silence the way he used every resource available to him, strategically. He ran the tactical map inside his head with obsessive precision. Verlick's coalition, Mercer's grain routes, Ashworth's control of the southern pass, Hale's river garrisons, 3 families whose combined resources could strangle Blackthorn's supply lines within weeks if they moved simultaneously. 3 families who had smiled at his table and bent their heads beneath his authority while building the scaffold he was supposed to hang from. He had missed it. That was the part that ground against the inside of his skull like glass embedded in a wound. He had missed it completely. 18 months of coalition building happening inside the kingdom he was supposed to control, and he had not seen a single thread because he had been too busy managing the machinery of dominance to notice that the machinery itself had been compromised. He had been governing the way his father had taught him, through fear, through surveillance, through the absolute conviction that if you made yourself terrifying enough, nothing could approach without your knowledge. But fear only worked on men who had something left to lose. The moment Verlick offered Mercer and Ashworth and Hale something worth more than their terror, power, territory, freedom from Ardenmoor dominance, the entire architecture of control Kedrick had spent his adult life perfecting became nothing but walls built on a foundation someone else had already hollowed out. The worst part was not the betrayal. Betrayal was a constant in Valadorn's political ecosystem, as predictable as winter and roughly as personal. The worst part was the realization that he had not been betrayed by weakness. He had been betrayed by his own design. The system that kept everyone afraid also kept everyone lying, and a man surrounded by liars eventually lost the ability to distinguish between obedience and the performance of obedience. His father had never taught him that lesson, probably because his father had died from it before he had the chance. They stopped at midday in a shallow cave formation where the wind could not reach them. Serafina dismounted with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had learned to ride in conditions that did not accommodate elegance, and she began unpacking rations without waiting for instruction. Dried meat, hard bread, a flask of something that burned going down and settled warm in the stomach. Kedrick watched her work. The cold had stripped the aristocratic polish from her appearance, leaving something rawer and more precise. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. Her cheeks were red from the wind. Her hands moved with the practiced speed of someone who understood that efficiency in hostile environments was not a preference, but a survival function. "Your father taught you to ride like this," Kedrick said. It was not a question. "My father taught me everything he thought I would need to survive without him." She handed him the flask without looking up. "He started when I was 9. I did not understand why until much later. He knew. He suspected. There is a difference, and it is the distance between preparation and paranoia." She sat back against the cave wall and took a piece of bread. "My father was not a paranoid man. He was a precise one. He kept records the way other men kept weapons, not because he expected to use them, but because he understood that the truth was the only thing that could not be taken from you by force. You could take a man's title, his land, his family. You could not take what he had already committed to paper and hidden where you could not reach." Kedrick drank from the flask. The heat spread through his chest and pushed against the cold that had settled there, not from the weather, but from the growing awareness that every hour of this journey carried them further from the fortress that had defined his identity and closer to a truth that might demolish it. "The letter," he said. "The one you retrieved from the library before we left." Serafina stopped chewing. The shift was microscopic, a fractional pause in her jaw, a slight narrowing of her eyes. But Kaedric had spent his life reading men's bodies for the involuntary signals they could not suppress, and he recognized the exact moment her carefully maintained composure absorbed the impact of his words. "You saw that," she said. "I see everything inside my own keep. That is not a boast. It is an operational reality. And you waited until now to mention it." "I wanted to see if you would tell me yourself. I was not hiding it. I was deciding how much of it to share before I understood where you stood. And now." She pulled the letter from inside her riding coat. The parchment was folded twice and sealed with dark red wax, bearing the impression of the Vale family crest, a tower standing against a storm. She held it between her gloved fingers and looked at Kaedric with an expression that carried the weight of every conversation they had avoided since the night she arrived at Blackthorn. "My father wrote this the night before they arrested him. I found it hidden inside the binding of a book he sent me 3 days before the execution, a book of northern territorial maps that he knew I would keep because he taught me to love cartography the way other fathers taught their daughters to love music." She paused. "It contains a list of names, every person involved in the conspiracy he uncovered, positions, alliances, financial channels, the complete architecture of Verlick's network." Kaedric's breathing remained steady. His face remained composed. But something behind his eyes shifted the way tectonic plates shifted, slowly, deep below the surface, with consequences that would not become visible until the ground itself began to crack. "You have been carrying proof of Verlick's conspiracy since before you arrived at Blackthorn." "Yes." "And you did not produce it when I asked you about your father on the terrace." "You asked me what I knew. I told you what I knew. I did not tell you what I had." She met his gaze without flinching. "There is a difference between those two things, and it is the distance between trusting someone with your thoughts and trusting them with your father's life work. And now you trust me. Now I need you. That is not the same thing, and pretending it is would be dishonest in a way neither of us can afford." The cave was silent, except for the wind howling past the entrance like something trying to get in. Kaedric looked at the letter in her hand and understood with the cold clarity of a man staring at the edge of a cliff that the document she held could accomplish two contradictory things simultaneously. It could destroy Verlick, and it could destroy Kaedric, because any list comprehensive enough to expose the full conspiracy would inevitably include the mechanisms by which an innocent man was condemned. Mechanisms that had required the tacit cooperation of every powerful house in Valadorn, including the one whose name was carved into the walls of Blackthorn Keep. "Show me," he said. She broke the seal. The list was written in Edric Vale's meticulous hand, each name accompanied by a date, a location, and a single line describing the individual's role in the network. Kaedric read it with the detached precision of a man performing surgery on himself. Every cut necessary, every cut agonizing, every cut revealing something he had been carrying inside his own body without knowing it. The names were damning. 3 of the king's senior advisors, 2 military commanders, a trade minister. Cassian Verlick at the center of it all, his connections spreading outward like a spider's web engineered with the patience of a man who understood that empires were not conquered through force, but through the systematic corruption of the structures that held them together. And at the bottom of the list, a name Kaedric had not expected. He read it twice, 3 times. Then he looked up at Seraphina, and whatever she saw in his face made her draw a sharp breath. "What?" she said. "Aldrich." The name hung in the frozen air between them like a blade suspended at the top of its arc. "Your steward," Seraphina said. "My steward. 14 years. The only man inside Blackthorn I trusted with information that could destroy me." Kaedric's voice was controlled in the way that pressure-forged steel was controlled, holding shape through forces that should have shattered it. "Listed here as Verlick's primary intelligence channel inside my household. Recruited 9 years ago through financial leverage. Reporting on my strategic decisions, military deployments, political communications, and personal vulnerabilities." He stopped speaking. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of an architecture collapsing. Not the physical walls of Blackthorn, which would stand for centuries regardless of the political weather, but the internal architecture. The system of trust and verification and controlled paranoia that Kaedric had built around himself the way a man built fortifications around a position he needed to hold at any cost. Aldrich was not just a steward. Aldrich was the foundation. The one variable Kaedric had never subjected to the same ruthless scrutiny he applied to everything else, because doing so would have meant admitting that his ability to judge loyalty, the single competency that justified his entire approach to governance, was fallible. And if his judgment was fallible, then every decision he had ever made was suspect. Every execution, every alliance, every act of calculated cruelty performed in the name of maintaining an order that had been compromised from inside the one relationship he had believed was solid. 9 years. Aldrich had been feeding Verlic intelligence for 9 years while standing 3 steps behind Kaedric in every meeting, every negotiation, every private moment of strategic vulnerability. 9 years of performance so perfect that the man who trusted no one had trusted him completely. That was the anatomy of real betrayal, not the dramatic confrontation, not the revealed villain, not the knife in the dark. The real thing was quieter. It lived inside the ordinary, inside the daily acts of apparent loyalty that turned out to be surveillance, inside the silence of a man who stood by your side for a decade and a half while carefully documenting every weakness you showed him, because you had believed your ability to read people was infallible, and that belief was itself the greatest weakness of all. "We left him in charge of Blackthorn," Seraphina said. The words cut through the internal collapse with surgical precision. Kaedric looked at her and watched the tactical implications arrange themselves across her face in real time. The same rapid processing he had observed from the first moment she walked into his hall, except now it was operating on information that changed every calculation either of them had made. "He knows we are heading for the Vale estate," Kaedric said. "He knows why. I told him to retrieve intelligence on Verlic's movements, which means he told Verlic we were investigating. He knows our departure time, our route, our lack of escort. He knows everything. He has always known everything. That was his function." Seraphina stood. The bread fell from her lap unnoticed. She moved to the cave entrance and looked out at the frozen landscape stretching away toward the horizon, and when she turned back, her face held something Kaedric had never seen from her before. Not fear, fury. The white-hot, focused, structural fury of a woman who had just realized the trap was not ahead of them, but behind them, and it had already closed. "Verlic did not send you that letter to leverage you," she said. "He sent it to make you react, to make you do exactly what you are doing right now. Leave Blackthorn, take me with you, ride into open territory without protection while his man controls your fortress and your communications and every strategic asset you possess." "I know." "You know. And yet here we are, 2 days' ride from safety, with no escort, no allies, and the one man you trusted controlling the only stronghold between us and annihilation." I said, "I know." "Then what do we do?" Kaedric closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, from the need to process information in darkness, the way he had learned to process everything in darkness when he was 7 years old and the world was nothing but rats and cold stone, and the understanding that nobody was coming to open the door. In the vault, he had discovered something essential about survival, that the mind worked differently when you stripped away every comfort and every assumption and every polite fiction about how the world operated. In the vault, there was no architecture, no strategy, no identity. There was only the raw question of what you were willing to become in order to still be breathing when the door finally opened. He opened his eyes. "We do not go back," he said. "Blackthorn is everything you have. Blackthorn is a building. What I have is the information in your hand and the fact that Verlic does not know I have it." He stood. The movement carried a different kind of energy than she had seen from him before. Not the controlled precision of a man managing his domain, but the lethal economy of someone who had stopped managing and started fighting. "Aldrich knows our route to the Vale estate, which means Verlic knows our route, which means whatever is waiting for us at the estate is not a concealed archive. It is a killing ground. Then we do not go to the estate. We go to the estate." He looked at her, "but not on the route Aldrich expects, and not for the reason Verlic anticipates." "Explain." "Verlic's strategy depends on control. He controls the information flow through Aldrich. He controls the political perimeter through Mercer, Ashworth, and Hale. He controls the narrative through the letter he sent me and the conspiracy he manufactured around your father's death. Every element is designed to force me into a position where my only options are the ones he has pre-selected. Kadrick's voice dropped into the register that men who had negotiated against him recognized as the most dangerous frequency: quiet, precise, entirely devoid of the emotional content that normally accompanied human speech. The weakness of any system built on total control is that it cannot adapt to variables it did not design for. And the variable is what? Me, doing something I have never done before. She waited, asking for help. The words sat between them with the awkward weight of a confession made by a man who had never practiced confessing, asking for help. 3 words that contradicted everything Kadrick Ardmore had built, every lesson the vault had taught him, every principle of dominance and self-sufficiency that had kept him alive and in power for 25 years. Men like Kadrick did not ask for help. They acquired resources. They leveraged relationships. They calculated obligations and deployed them like ammunition. But asking, the genuine act of admitting inadequacy and requesting another human being to fill the gap, was a form of vulnerability so foreign to his operational framework that saying it aloud felt like speaking a language he had only ever heard others use. Serafina studied him for a long time. The wind changed direction outside the cave, and the howling dropped to a lower frequency that made the silence between them feel more intimate and more dangerous. "Who?" she said. "Captain Brannock, former commander of the King's northern garrison. My father exiled him 15 years ago for refusing to execute unarmed prisoners during the Ashenmore uprising. He has been living in a settlement 3 hours from here, running a trading post and pretending the kingdom forgot about him." "Did the kingdom forget about him?" "I did not. I have kept intelligence on Brannock since my father's death because he represents a resource I always knew I might need someday. A military commander with no political allegiance, no financial leverage, and no reason to lie to anyone about anything because he already lost everything a man can lose and survived it." He paused. "He also hates me, which, under the circumstances, makes him the most trustworthy person available." "You want to ride to a man who hates you and ask him to help you retake your own fortress from a traitor you personally elevated to the most sensitive position in your household?" "Yes." "And you think he will agree because Verlick's conspiracy threatens every settlement in the Northern Territory, including his, and because Brannock is the kind of man who does the right thing even when the person asking him is the wrong person to be asking." Kadrick met her gaze. "I am told such men exist. I have never understood them, but I have always envied them." Something shifted in Serafina's expression. Not softening, she did not soften, any more than the cliffs outside softened under the assault of the sea. But the rigidity changed quality. It went from defensive to something closer to evaluative, the way a woman looked at a structure she had believed was condemned when she noticed a load-bearing wall she had not accounted for. "My father would have liked you," she said quietly. "Not the version of you that stood on the balcony. The version standing in front of me right now, inside a cave, covered in frost, admitting he does not know how to do this alone." She paused. "That version is more dangerous than the Duke, because that version can actually change." Kadrick said nothing. There was nothing to say. The woman had a surgical gift for locating the precise intersection between truth and damage, and every time she deployed it, he felt another section of the internal architecture give way. Not collapsing, exactly, but restructuring. Reorganizing itself around a new load-bearing principle he did not yet have a name for. They packed the rations, mounted the horses, and turned north away from the Vale estate, away from the route Aldrich had mapped and Verlick had anticipated, into territory that Kadrick knew by memory and instinct because he had been surveying Valadorn's geography since he was old enough to read a map. The trading post appeared 2 hours later, a squat stone building hunkered against the base of a ridge with smoke rising from its chimney and a fence of sharpened timber surrounding a yard full of barrels and crates and the organized chaos of frontier commerce. A sign above the door read, "Brannock Supply," in letters that had been painted once and beaten by weather into near illegibility. Kadrick dismounted and stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the building the way a man looked at a door he had been avoiding for a decade and a half. Then the front door opened, and a man stepped out. Brannock was broad, gray-haired, built like something quarried rather than born. His face carried the deep lines of a life lived mostly outdoors and mostly without the cushioning of wealth or status. His eyes were the pale blue of glacial water, and they fixed on Cadric with an expression that combined recognition, contempt, and something that might have been dark amusement into a single devastating glance. "Well," Brannock said, "that is something I did not expect to see standing in my yard." "Captain Brannock." "Not a captain for 15 years, thanks to your family. Just a man who sells rope and lamp oil to people who actually work for a living." He leaned against the doorframe and crossed arms that looked capable of bending iron. "Duke Ardenmore. Riding without escort in winter, with a woman who looks like she has a more interesting reason for being here than you do." His eyes moved to Seraphina. "Lady Vale, you look like your father." "You knew him," Seraphina said. "I served under him for 3 years before the Ardenmore family decided competence and conscience were mutually exclusive qualities in a military commander." He looked back at Cadric. "You are a long way from your tower, Your Grace. What broke?" Cadric stood in the frozen yard with wind cutting through his coat and the ruins of his certainty piled invisibly around his feet, and said the words he had never said to anyone in his life. "Everything, and I need your help." Brannock stared at him. The pale eyes did not blink. The arms did not uncross. The expression on that weathered face shifted through something complex and private, and when it settled, it held the particular quality of a man who had waited 15 years to hear something he never actually expected to hear. "Come inside," he said, "before the cold finishes whatever job brought you here." They stepped through the door into warmth and lamplight, and Cadric felt the threshold beneath his boot like a physical boundary between the man he had been and whatever he was about to become. Behind them, the northern wind screamed across the empty yard and drove fresh snow over the hoofprints leading to Brannock's door, erasing the trail in minutes. But 3 ridgelines to the south, where the frozen pass narrowed between cliff faces that blocked the wind and funneled sound into silence, 4 riders in unmarked black armor sat motionless on dark horses, watching the trading post through the gray curtain of falling snow. The lead rider lowered a brass spyglass and turned to the man beside him. "Confirmed. Both targets inside." The second rider nodded and pulled a sealed letter from his saddlebag bearing Aldrich's handwriting. He cracked it open, read the contents, and burned it in his gloved palm without expression. "Send word to Lord Verlick," he said. "Tell him the Duke left the road exactly where the steward predicted, and tell him Brannock's settlement is not defensible." He gathered his reins and turned his horse south. "We move at nightfall." The snow continued to fall, and inside the trading post, Cadric Ardenmore sat across a rough wooden table from a man his family had destroyed, holding a dead man's letter in hands that had signed execution orders, and tried to remember how to be something other than the monster his father had built. Because for the first time in his life, being that monster was not enough to survive what was coming, and the walls he had spent 25 years hiding behind were now the exact shape of the cage his enemies had designed for him. Brannock poured 3 cups of something dark from a clay jug and set them on the table without ceremony. The liquid smelled like grain alcohol and regret. The trading post's interior was exactly what its exterior promised. Rough timber walls, a low ceiling blackened by years of chimney smoke, shelves stacked with rope coils and lantern oil and dried provisions organized with the obsessive neatness of a man who had spent enough years under military discipline that civilian life could not fully undo the habit. Cadric wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the warmth seep into joints that had been clenched against cold for hours. Across the table, Brannock sat with his arms crossed and his glacial eyes fixed on the Duke, with the patient hostility of a man waiting for the other shoe to land on his neck. "Talk," Brannock said. Cadric talked. He laid it out with the same precision he applied to military briefings. Verlick's conspiracy, the fabricated treason charges against Edric Vale, Aldrich's betrayal, the political coalition forming around Blackthorn like a noose tightening in slow motion. He did not soften the details. He did not frame himself as anything other than what he was, a man who had participated in the machinery of an innocent man's death through the specific crime of not questioning it when questioning was the only moral option available. Brannick listened without interrupting. His expression did not change. When Caedric finished, the silence lasted long enough for the fire in the hearth to pop twice and settle. 9 years, Brannick said. 9 years. Your steward. The man who managed your intelligence, your communications, your household security, feeding everything to Verlick for 9 years while you sat in your tower believing you were the smartest man in the kingdom. Yes. And now you are sitting in my trading post asking for help because the tower turned out to be a cage and every lock on every door was installed by the man you trusted to guard them. That is an accurate summary. Brannick drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looked at Serafina, who had been sitting quietly with her father's letter spread open on the table between them, like a map of a country that no longer existed. Your father was a good man, Brannick said to her. The only man I ever served under who treated military authority as a responsibility rather than a license. When the Ardenmore family stripped my command for refusing to execute prisoners, Edric Vale was the only voice on the council who objected. He paused. He lost political capital for it. He did it anyway. That was the kind of man he was. I know what kind of man he was, Serafina said. Her voice was steady, but the edges carried something raw, like metal that had been filed down to a point. What I need to know is whether you are the kind of man who will help me prove it. Brannick studied her. Then he looked at Caedric with an expression that mixed contempt and something grudgingly close to respect into a compound that had no comfortable name. How many men do you need? I do not need an army, Caedric said. Armies are what Verlick expects. He has spent 18 months building a strategy designed to counter everything I have done for the last decade. Military force, political pressure, surveillance, intimidation. He has prepared for the Duke of Blackthorn. He is not prepared for something else. Something else meaning what? A man with nothing left to leverage except the truth, and 2 people willing to ride through a snowstorm to use it. Brannick's jaw tightened. That is a pretty speech. Sounds almost human. But pretty speeches do not take back fortresses, Your Grace. Aldrich controls Blackthorn. Verlick controls the political coalition. You are 2 days' ride from your seat of power with no escort, no communications, and no way to know whether the men inside your own walls will follow your orders or Verlick's when the moment comes. He leaned forward. So I'm going to ask you again, and this time I want tactics instead of philosophy. What do you need? Caedric reached across the table and turned the letter so Brannick could read it. The former captain's eyes moved down the list of names with the speed of a man who had spent decades processing intelligence documents under pressure. His face changed as he read. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the small ways that mattered. The tightening around the eyes, the slight forward lean of the shoulders, the barely perceptible shift in breathing that accompanied the recognition that the document in front of him was not just evidence, but a weapon capable of reshaping the political landscape of the entire kingdom. This is everything, Brannick said. This is everything Edric Vale gathered before they killed him for gathering it. And you want to get it to the crown. I want to get it to the right people inside the crown, not the king's council. Verlick owns too much of it. The military tribunal, General Castaigne. She commands the king's personal guard and reports directly to the throne without passing through the advisory structure. If this document reaches her, Verlick's network is exposed from the inside and his coalition loses its political protection. Brannick leaned back. Castaigne is in the capital. The capital is 6 days' ride from here in good weather. This is not good weather. Which is why I am not riding to the capital. Then who is? Caedric looked at Serafina. The moment hung between them with the weight of something that had been building since the first night she stood in Blackthorn's great hall and refused to lower her eyes. He watched her process his meaning. The rapid calculation behind the amber eyes, the slight parting of her lips, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine as she understood what he was asking and what it would cost. No, she said. You are the only one who can authenticate the document, the Vale family seal. Your father's handwriting, the concealed archive only you know about. Without your testimony, the letter is an unverified accusation from a disgraced duke against a respected political figure. With your testimony, it is proof. And while I ride to the capital with the only evidence that can save both of us, what exactly do you plan to do? Take back Blackthorn. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind shifted direction and hit the trading post's north wall with enough force to make the timber groan. "You just said Verlick has prepared for military force," Serafina said. "You said he has counters for everything you have done in the last decade. And now you want to ride back to a fortress controlled by a traitor with no army and no leverage and take it back through sheer force of will." "Not will. Knowledge." Kedrick's voice dropped into the frequency that had made him the most feared negotiator in Valadorn. Not louder, but denser, as if the words themselves were being compressed into something that could not be argued with. Aldrich has been managing Blackthorn's security for 14 years. He designed the watch rotations, the gate protocols, the communication channels between the keep and the outer garrisons. He knows every official entrance, every patrol route, every vulnerability in the system. That is the problem, not the solution. That is the problem if I use the system he designed. Blackthorn was not built by Aldrich. It was built by Ardenmoor lords across 3 centuries. The fortress has passages and access points that predate the current security architecture by 200 years. Passages that are not on any document Aldrich has ever seen because they are not on any document at all. They exist in the memory of the bloodline. He paused. "My father showed them to me when I was a boy, before the vault, before the lessons in darkness and dominance. He showed me the hidden ways in and out of Blackthorn because his father had shown him, and his father before that. It was the one thing every Ardenmoor heir was taught before they were taught to be afraid." Brannick's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Secret passages. You are staking your life on secret passages. I am staking my life on the fact that the only person alive who knows those routes is sitting in this room. Aldrich does not know them. Verlick does not know them. The men waiting outside on the ridgeline do not know them." The silence that followed was absolute. Serafina and Brannick both looked at him with expressions that confirmed his statement had landed. "You knew," Serafina said. "That we were followed? I knew before we stopped at the cave. 4 riders, unmarked armor, maintaining a 3 ridgeline distance since we crossed the northern pass. Standard Verlick surveillance formation, close enough to track, far enough to avoid engagement. They are waiting for nightfall. And you did not mention this. I needed to see how far they would follow before positioning. Now I know. They have committed to this location, which means Verlick's operational window is fixed. He expects to take us here, which means his resources are concentrated here, which means the route south is thinner than he can afford." Brannick stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a blade on stone. He crossed to the window and looked out at the darkening sky through the narrow gap between the shutters. When he turned back, his face had undergone a transformation. The civilian was gone, and in his place stood the captain, the man who had commanded the king's northern garrison and walked away from power rather than compromise his principles. The man who had spent 15 years pretending he was just a traitor, while the instincts of command lived inside his bones waiting for something worthy of resurrection. "How many men do you have at the trading post?" Kedrick said. 4. Former soldiers, all of them. Men who ended up here for the same reason I did. The kingdom decided their conscience was more inconvenient than their skill." Brannick paused. "They are not an army." "They do not need to be an army. They need to be a diversion." Kedrick stood and moved to the table where a rough-drawn map of the Northern Territory was pinned beneath a lantern. His finger traced the route from Brannick's settlement south to the main road and then west toward Blackthorn. Verlick's riders are positioned to intercept movement toward the Vale Estate or back toward Blackthorn along the primary routes. They are not positioned to intercept movement south toward the capital, because that route leads away from everything Verlick considers strategically relevant. He looked at Serafina. "You leave tonight, before the riders move. Brannick's men escort you through the southern forest to the Coldwater Road. From there it is 4 days' hard ride to the capital if you do not stop. And the riders on the ridge. Brannick and I give them something to look at: firelight, movement, the appearance of targets still inside the trading post. When they move at nightfall, they find 2 men in a defensible position instead of the 4 people they expected. By the time they report the discrepancy to Verlick, you are 2 days ahead on a route no one is watching." "And you," Serafina said. The word carried something she had not allowed into her voice before, not fear, concern. The specific concern of a woman who had just realized she was being asked to leave behind the one variable in her current situation that she could not calculate the survival probability of. 2 men against 4 trained soldiers, and whatever reinforcements Verlick sends when his advance team reports. 3 men. I'm counting myself. Kadric. It was the first time she had used his name. Not his title, not your grace. His name. The sound of it in her voice did something to the inside of his chest that he would not have been able to describe under torture, and the worst part was that he did not want it to stop. I have survived worse odds, he said quietly. You have survived worse odds behind walls, behind armies, behind the infrastructure of an empire designed to keep you alive. This is a trading post with a timber fence and a man who hates you. Hated, Brannick said from the window. Both of them looked at him. The former captain's face was unreadable in the dimming light, but something in his posture had settled. The decision had been made somewhere inside him during the last 30 seconds, and it showed in the way his weight had shifted from guarded to committed. Hated is past tense. I have not decided on present tense yet, but it will not be determined tonight because I am not planning on dying in my own trading post to protect a man I spent 15 years despising. He looked at Kadric. I am doing it because the conspiracy that killed Edric Vale is the same system that destroyed my career and sent 47 good soldiers into exile for the crime of having a conscience. Verlick is not just your enemy. He is the rot at the center of everything wrong with this kingdom. And if burning my own house down is what it takes to expose him, then I will light the match myself. Kadric nodded. It was the smallest gesture he could make, and it contained more genuine respect than anything he had expressed in years. They moved fast. Serafina changed into riding gear Brannick provided. Heavy wool, leather overlayer, boots lined with fur that had seen better decades but would hold against the cold. She strapped the letter inside a waterproof pouch against her body, close enough that she would feel its weight with every step the horse took. Brannick's 4 men were everything their captain had described: quiet, efficient, scarred by the particular kind of experience that could not be faked, and could not be trained into men who lacked the raw material. They armed themselves without being told, saddled horses without wasting motion, and assembled in the yard with the grim competence of soldiers who had been waiting 15 years for orders that mattered. The sky was the color of a bruise. Snow fell in thick curtains that reduced visibility to 50 yards and turned the landscape into a white void with no edges and no horizon. Perfect cover. Kadric stood in the yard as Serafina mounted her horse. She gathered the reins and looked down at him, and in the failing light her face held something he had never seen directed at him from any human being. Not submission, not defiance, not calculation, not the carefully modulated diplomacy of political alliance. Something unarmored, something that had cost her as much to show as his 3 words in the cave had cost him. If you die in this trading post, she said, I will bring Verlick down anyway, but it will take longer and it will be uglier and I will be angrier than any court in Valadorn is prepared to handle. Noted. And Kadric? Yes. When I stood in your great hall that first night and looked at you, I was not measuring the monster. She paused. The snow caught in her dark hair and melted against the heat of her skin. I was looking for the man underneath. I was not sure he existed. And now I am riding 4 days through a blizzard to save his kingdom for him. The ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed her face and disappeared. That should tell you everything you need to know. She turned the horse and rode south into the white void. Brannick's men closed formation around her within seconds, and within a minute the snow had swallowed them entirely, 5 shapes dissolving into a landscape that looked like the world had been erased and no one had started redrawing it yet. Kadric stood alone in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats fade until there was nothing left but the wind and his own heartbeat and the understanding that he had just sent the only person he had ever trusted with his weakness into a 4-day gauntlet with no guarantee she would reach the other end. He had spent his entire life eliminating variables he could not control. Now the most important variable in his existence was riding away from him into a storm, carrying the only evidence that could save them both. And every instinct forged in 25 years of absolute dominance screamed at him to chase her, to bring her back, to lock her inside the nearest fortified position and manage the outcome himself, because that was what Ceadric Ardmore did. He controlled. He contained. He dominated. But the man standing in the snow watching Serafina Vale disappear was not the same man who had stood on a balcony and watched her father die without asking why. That man had been a machine operating inside a system designed by his father and maintained by his steward, and never once questioned, because questioning meant admitting the machine might be broken, and broken machines could not protect you from the dark. This man was something else, something unfinished. Something standing in an open yard with no walls and no army and no certainty about what would happen next, and discovering that the absence of certainty did not feel like weakness. It felt like the first honest breath he had taken in 25 years. "They will come in 2 hours," Brannick said from the doorway. "Maybe less. The snow gives us cover, but it gives them cover too. Then we use the 2 hours." They worked in darkness. Brannick knew the terrain around his settlement the way Caedric knew the corridors of Blackthorn. Every depression, every rock formation, every angle that provided advantage or concealed approach. They built the trading post into a trap, lamp oil along the timber fence, a secondary position behind the stone well in the yard, firelight arranged inside the building to cast shadows that suggested 4 occupants rather than 2. Every preparation was made with the methodical precision of men who understood that survival in unequal engagements was not about strength. It was about making the other side pay more than they planned to spend. The riders came with the storm. 4 shapes materialized from the white curtain at the yard's perimeter, moving in a spread formation designed to cut off retreat in every direction. Their armor was dark. Their weapons were drawn. They moved with the disciplined efficiency of men who had been told their targets were a disgraced duke and a former captain well past his fighting years, and who had no reason to expect anything more complicated than execution. They were wrong. The first rider hit the oil line at the fence. Brannick's torch caught the trail, and fire erupted across the northern perimeter with a sound like the sky tearing open. The blast of heat and light turned the snowy yard into a furnace of orange and black, and sent 2 horses screaming sideways into each other while their riders fought for control. Caedric moved out of the darkness behind the well. He had stripped his riding coat. His arms were bare beneath the leather guard straps, and the cold hit his skin like a blade. But cold was just information, and information was something he processed without emotional interference. He covered the distance to the nearest dismounted rider in 4 strides and hit him with a force that came from somewhere below the strategy. Below the calculation, from the place where a 7-year-old boy had learned that the only way to survive in the dark was to become more dangerous than anything else in it. The rider went down. The second rider wheeled his horse and came at Caedric with a sword swing that would have taken his head if Brannick had not stepped out of the smoke and put a crossbow bolt through the man's shoulder at 15 yards. The rider screamed and dropped his weapon, and Caedric caught him off the saddle by the collar and slammed him into the frozen ground hard enough to end the conversation. 2 down, 2 remaining. The third rider had circled the building. He came around the corner at a gallop and nearly ran Brannick down before the old captain rolled sideways behind a water trough and came up with a short sword that he handled like a man who had never stopped being a soldier, no matter how many years of rope and lamp oil he piled on top of the muscle memory. But the fourth rider was already through the fence. He dismounted in the yard and walked toward Caedric through the firelight with the unhurried gait of a man who had been sent to do a specific job and intended to finish it regardless of what was burning around him. His armor bore no insignia, but his bearing said everything. Professional, focused, the kind of soldier Verlick paid premium rates for. He carried a long sword in his right hand and a short blade in his left, and his eyes locked onto Caedric with the flat assessment of a man evaluating how long this would take. Caedric picked up the fallen rider's sword. The weight was wrong, heavier than what he trained with, balanced for a larger man. But weight was just another variable, and variables were things he adjusted for. They circled each other in the burning yard. Snow fell through smoke and firelight in spirals that made the air itself look like it was disintegrating. The heat from the fence fire warped the darkness around them into something liquid and unstable. The soldiers struck first, fast, disciplined. A diagonal cut followed by a thrust with the short blade that was designed to end fights quickly against opponents who relied on single-weapon technique. Caedric blocked the cut, sidestepped the thrust, and answered with a counter that opened a shallow line across the soldier's forearm. First blood. But the soldier did not slow. They exchanged blows in a sequence that lasted less than 40 seconds. but felt like it compressed an entire lifetime into the space between each impact. Steel against steel, the sound cutting through the roar of fire and wind. Kedrick's arms burned from the unfamiliar weight. His bare skin stung where the cold and the sparks competed for which could damage him faster. Sweat ran down his spine and mixed with the snow melting on his shoulders, and every breath tasted like smoke and iron and something chemical that he recognized as his own body burning through its reserves. The soldier feinted low and came high. The longsword caught the edge of Kedrick's guard and skidded along the leather strap on his forearm, slicing through it and opening the skin beneath in a line that went from wrist to elbow. Blood came immediately. Hot, shocking in its volume against the cold air. It ran down his hand and made the sword grip slick and turned the frozen ground beneath his feet into something treacherous. Kedrick did not stop. A man who has spent his entire life building walls around himself discovers something specific when those walls come down. He discovers that the walls were never protecting him from the outside. They were containing what lived inside. And what lived inside Kedrick Ardmore, beneath the strategy, beneath the cruelty, beneath the decades of controlled dominance and calculated fear, was something that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with survival at its most fundamental, most animal, most honest level. He did not fight like a duke. He fought like a man standing between everything he had become and the one chance he had to become something else. The soldier came in hard. Final commitment. Both blades driving toward Kedrick's center in a strike meant to finish the fight in a single motion. Kedrick dropped his guard, stepped inside the arc of both weapons, inside the killing range, where the blades could not reach full extension, and drove his shoulder into the soldier's chest with every pound of force his body could generate. They went down together. The impact drove the air out of both of them. Kedrick hit the frozen ground on his injured arm, and the pain was a white explosion that wiped everything else clean. The soldier rolled and tried to bring the short blade up, but Kedrick caught his wrist and twisted and felt something give beneath his grip, with a sound that was wrong in every way a sound could be wrong, and the blade dropped into the snow. Kedrick pinned him. One hand on the soldier's throat, one knee on his sword arm. Blood from his own wound dripping onto the man's armor in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Fast, irregular, odd. "Who sent you?" Kedrick said. His voice was wrecked, raw, stripped of every frequency that had made it an instrument of political control and reduced to nothing but human demand. The soldier stared up at him through the smoke and firelight. His face was young beneath the professional mask. 25, maybe. Young enough to still be someone's son. "Aldrich," the soldier said. "Direct orders, confirm the Duke's position. Neutralize if possible. Report to Lord Verlick upon completion." Neutralize. Kedrick tasted the word. "He sent 4 men to neutralize me." "You were supposed to be with the woman and no military escort." The soldier's breathing was shallow, strained beneath Kedrick's weight. "We were told you had gone soft." Kedrick looked down at the man beneath him. Young, trained, following orders from a chain of command that treated human lives as operational variables, and saw himself. 20 years younger, before the vault had finished its work, before the architecture had hardened into something that could not distinguish between strength and cruelty. He released the soldier's throat. "Stay down," he said. "When this is over, you will be given a choice. Prison or testimony. Choose testimony, and you might survive this with something resembling a future." He stood. The yard was settling. Brannick had the third rider disarmed and pinned against the water trough, with a knee on his back and a blade against his neck, breathing hard but steady. The old captain's body remembering everything 15 years of civilian life had tried to make it forget. The fence was still burning. Snow melted in a wide circle around the flames, turning the ground to black mud. 2 horses had fled into the storm. 2 others stood trembling against the far wall, too well trained to bolt, but too frightened to stop shaking. Kedrick pressed his hand against the wound on his forearm. The blood was slowing but not stopping. The cold would help with that. One advantage of fighting in a frozen wasteland. He looked at Brannick across the ruined yard and saw the former captain looking back at him with an expression that had finally settled into its present tense. Not hatred, not respect. Recognition. The acknowledgement of one soldier to another that what had just happened in this burning yard was not politics or strategy or the calculated maneuvering of powerful men. It was two human beings choosing to stand in an open field and fight for something that mattered more than the empire either of them had lost. "You fight like an idiot," Brannick said, breathing hard. "No guard, no footwork. You charged inside his blade range like a man who forgot he was supposed to survive." Did it work? It worked because he expected a duke. He got something else. Brannick stood and wiped the blade on his trousers. "You need to bind that arm before you bleed out in my yard. I have had enough aristocratic blood on my property for one lifetime." Kadrick looked south. The storm had thickened into a wall of white that obliterated everything beyond 20 yards. Somewhere inside that wall, Serafina Vale was riding toward the capital with 5 soldiers and a document that could reshape the kingdom. 4 days. She needed 4 days, and every minute that Verlick did not know her route was a minute she gained. "Bind it fast," Kadrick said. "We ride for Blackthorn tonight." "You cannot take Blackthorn with 2 men and a bleeding arm." "I am not taking Blackthorn with 2 men and a bleeding arm." He turned to Brannick, and his face held something the old captain had never seen on an Ardenmoor. The specific expression of a man who had stopped trying to control the outcome and started trusting the process. "I am taking Blackthorn with the truth, and the one entrance that no traitor in my household has ever known exists." Brannick stared at him for 3 long seconds. Then he shook his head with the resigned exasperation of a man who had just realized he was going to follow a bleeding duke through a blizzard into a fortress controlled by an enemy using nothing but a secret passage and the faint hope that honesty was worth more than an army. "Your father was a monster," Brannick said. "Yes." "You were becoming the same thing." "Yes." "What changed?" Kadrick looked south one more time. The storm had erased every trace of Serafina's departure, every hoofprint, every shadow. She was gone, and the only evidence she had ever existed was the hollow space she had left inside his chest that no amount of control or architecture or strategic calculation could fill. "She did not kneel," he said. And somewhere on the Coldwater Road, 4 days from the capital, Serafina Vale rode through the worst storm the Northern Territory had seen in a decade, with a dead man's letter against her skin and the sound of her own heartbeat counting down the hours until either the truth reached the throne or Verlick's men reached her first. And behind her, growing smaller with every mile, the faint orange glow of a burning fence on the horizon that told her 2 men were still fighting, still standing, still alive, and the night was far from over. They reached Blackthorn at the dead hour between midnight and dawn, when the cold was so absolute it turned breath into something visible and fragile, small ghosts escaping from their mouths and dissolving into darkness before they could fully form. The fortress rose against the starless sky like a wound in the landscape, all vertical obsidian and iron spires stabbing upward into the overcast ceiling of the world. From the cliff path below, Kadrick could see torchlight moving behind the narrow windows of the upper gallery. Patrols that should not have been active at this hour, walking routes that did not match any rotation he had authorized. Aldrich had reorganized the guard. Brannick crouched beside him on the frozen ledge, studying the fortress with the clinical attention of a man who had spent decades assessing defensive positions. The wind off the sea hammered against the cliff face below them, throwing salt spray upward in bursts that stung exposed skin and left a thin crust of ice on every surface it touched. "How many inside?" Brannick said. "Standard garrison is 60. Aldrich may have supplemented with Verlick's men, could be as high as 80. And how many of the 60 are loyal to you versus loyal to whoever signs their next meal?" Kadrick did not answer immediately. The question cut deeper than tactics. Loyalty in Blackthorn had always been a function of fear. Men obeyed because the cost of disobedience was absolute. He had never tested whether that obedience contained anything underneath the terror, any residue of genuine allegiance, because testing it would have required admitting that fear alone might not be enough. And admitting that would have meant questioning every principle his father had embedded in his bones in that dark vault 25 years ago. "I do not know," he said. "First honest answer you have given me that actually sounds honest. I have been practicing." Brannick exhaled something that might have been a laugh in warmer circumstances. "The passage. Where?" Kadrick led him down the cliff path to a section of rock face that looked identical to every other section, vertical, weather-beaten, unremarkable. He counted 12 paces from a natural fissure in the stone and pressed his hand against what appeared to be solid rock. The surface gave inward by half an inch. A seam appeared, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to press, and a section of the cliff face swung inward on iron hinges so old they had fossilized into the stone itself. The passage beyond was narrow and dark, and smelled like salt and centuries of accumulated moisture. The ceiling was low enough that both men had to duck, and the floor was uneven stone worn smooth by generations of Ardenmoor feet, walking paths that were never recorded and never spoken about outside the bloodline. Kadrick had last walked this passage when he was 14, following his father's shadow through the darkness by sound alone because the old duke had refused to carry a lantern. "The darkness is the passage," his father had said. "If you need light to navigate it, you do not deserve to know it exists." At the time, Kadrick had absorbed the lesson the way he absorbed everything his father taught him, as gospel delivered by the only authority he recognized. Now, moving through the same darkness 20 years later with a bleeding arm and a former enemy at his back, he understood something his father had never intended to teach him. The passage was not about darkness. It was about knowing your own house well enough to move through it blind. It was about the difference between controlling a place and belonging to it. His father had controlled Blackthorn. Kadrick was beginning to understand what it might mean to belong to it instead. The passage climbed through the interior of the cliff for several hundred yards before leveling into a horizontal corridor that ran beneath the keep's foundation. The air changed, warmer, drier, carrying the faint vibration of the fortress above them like a heartbeat transmitted through stone. Kadrick navigated by memory and touch, his injured hand trailing along the left wall while his right held the short sword Brannick had given him. The wound on his forearm had been bound with strips torn from his riding shirt, and the bandage was already stiff with dried blood. But the bleeding had stopped and the cold had numbed the worst of the pain into a dull, persistent ache that he processed the same way he processed all physical discomfort, as information that required acknowledgement but not response. They emerged inside the keep's lower levels through a panel concealed behind a storage chamber that had not been used in decades. Dust covered every surface. Crates of supplies that predated Kadrick's birth sat stacked against walls that sweated condensation in the faint warmth seeping down from the inhabited floors above. Kadrick pressed his ear against the chamber door and listened. Footsteps above. Distant voices. The muted sounds of a fortress operating under new management. Subtle differences in rhythm and tone that told him everything he needed to know about how thoroughly Aldrich had restructured the household in his absence. The patrol intervals were tighter. The movement patterns were more regimented. The silence between footsteps had a different quality. Not the disciplined quiet of a household that feared its master, but the tense quiet of a garrison expecting trouble. Aldrich was not just managing Blackthorn. He was fortifying it, preparing for the possibility that Kadrick might return. "He knows you might come back," Brannick whispered, reading the same information from the sounds above. "He has always known everything I might do. That was his value." Kadrick paused. It was also his weapon. "Then how do we move through a fortress where the man controlling it can predict your every decision?" Kadrick looked at Brannick in the near darkness. The former captain's face was barely visible, just the pale glint of his eyes and the hard line of his jaw. And in that dim light, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been discarded by the system and survived it and come out the other side carrying nothing but his principles and the stubborn refusal to pretend they did not matter. "We do not move through it," Kadrick said. "We move through the version of it that Aldrich does not control." Meaning the people, not the walls, not the gates, not the patrol routes, the people inside them. He met Brannick's eyes. Aldrich controls Blackthorn's infrastructure. He controls its communications, its security systems, its operational architecture. But he does not control the 60 men and women who live inside these walls and wake up every morning deciding whether to follow orders because they are afraid or because they choose to. That decision is the one variable Aldrich has never been able to monitor, because it lives inside individual human beings, and human beings are the one system that cannot be fully instrumentalized, no matter how sophisticated the surveillance. Brannick stared at him. You are betting your life on the possibility that people who have obeyed you out of terror for a decade will choose to help you now because you show up bleeding in the basement asking nicely. I am betting my life on the possibility that fear is not the only thing I ever gave them. The words sat between them like a match struck in a dark room. Small, insufficient, but producing just enough light to see the next step. They moved upward through the keep's service corridors, passages designed for servants and supply transport that ran parallel to the main hallways but were narrower, less monitored, and largely ignored by whatever security structure Aldrich had implemented. Kedrick knew these corridors the way he knew the passage through the cliffs, not from strategic study, but from childhood, from the years before the vault when he had been a boy exploring his own home with the aimless curiosity that children applied to the world before adults taught them to be afraid of it. The first person they encountered was a kitchen woman named Marin. She was carrying a tray of bread toward the servants' dining hall when she rounded a corner and came face to face with the Duke of Blackthorn, standing in a service corridor at 3 in the morning with blood on his arm and a stranger at his back. The tray did not fall. Her hands tightened on its edges and her eyes went wide, but the tray did not fall, and that small act of composure told Kedrick something about the woman that 14 years of barely noticing her existence had failed to communicate. "Your Grace," she whispered. "Marin." He said her name. He had learned it from Serafina, who had learned every servant's name within her first week at Blackthorn, and the sound of it coming from his mouth produced an effect on the kitchen woman's face that was difficult to categorize. Surprise, confusion, something tentative that lived in the space between disbelief and hope. "Aldrich told us you were conducting border inspections," she said. "He told us you would not return for a week." "Aldrich told you many things. Most of them were designed to serve interests that are not mine and are not yours." She looked at his arm, the bandage, the blood. The fact that the Duke of Blackthorn was standing in a servant's corridor looking less like a ruler and more like a man who had crawled out of a fight and kept moving because stopping was not something he could afford. "What do you need?" she said. The question was simple, 4 words. But the way she said it, without hesitation, without calculation, without the reflexive terror that had characterized every interaction between Kedrick and his household staff for as long as he could remember, carried a weight that made his chest constrict in a way he could not attribute to the cold or the wound or the exhaustion settling into his bones like lead. "I need you to trust me," he said, "and I need you to tell me how many people in this household will do the same." Marin studied him for 3 seconds. Then she set the tray on the floor, straightened, and said, "More than you think, Your Grace. The lady changed things while she was here. Small things. Names, meals, the way you looked at the boy in the courtyard when she told you to let him go." She paused. "We noticed." Serafina. Even in absence, she was reshaping Blackthorn from the inside, the way water reshaped stone, not through force but through the patient, persistent refusal to stop being what she was. Within the hour, Kedrick had a network. Not an army, not a tactical force. A network of kitchen staff, stable hands, chambermaids, and maintenance workers who moved through Blackthorn's service corridors like blood through capillaries, invisible to the fortress's central nervous system, but essential to every function it performed. They carried messages. They mapped patrol positions. They identified which guards were Aldrich's imports and which were original Blackthorn garrison soldiers who had been following new orders because no one had given them an alternative. The answer, when it came, was both humbling and devastating. Of the 60 original garrison members, 43 had been effectively sidelined by Aldrich's restructuring, reassigned to peripheral duties, confined to quarters during off hours, stripped of communication access. They had not resisted because resistance without leadership was just chaos, and chaos in a fortress was suicide. But they had not capitulated either. They had waited. The way soldiers waited when they knew the situation was wrong but did not yet have the information or the authority to act on that knowledge. Kedrick gave them both. He appeared in the garrison barracks at 4 in the morning, walking through the door without announcement, without escort, without any of the ceremonial armor of authority he had spent his career constructing around himself. He was wearing a torn riding shirt. His arm was bandaged in bloody strips. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had ridden through a blizzard, fought 4 soldiers in a burning yard, crawled through a secret passage in his own cliff, and climbed through the service corridors of his own fortress because the front door was controlled by someone who had been selling his secrets for nearly a decade. The barracks went silent. 43 soldiers looked at the Duke of Blackthorn and saw something none of them had ever seen before. Not the iron authority, not the controlled menace, not the calculated precision that had made every interaction with their commander feel like a performance reviewed by someone who graded on a fatal curve. They saw a man. Aldrich has been reporting to Cassian Verlick for 9 years, Kedrick said. His voice was raw, and he did not try to smooth it. Every strategic decision I have made, every military deployment, every political communication has been monitored and transmitted to a man who is engineering the collapse of the Northern Territories and the overthrow of the Crown. Lord Edric Vale discovered this conspiracy and was executed for it on fabricated treason charges that I failed to question because questioning them would have required me to admit that my judgment was fallible and my steward was a traitor, and the system I built to control everything had been controlling me. He paused. Let the words settle into a room full of men who had been trained to obey without understanding, and were now being given understanding, without being ordered to do anything with it. Evidence of Verlick's conspiracy is on its way to the capital right now. When it arrives, his network collapses. But between now and then, Aldrich controls this fortress, and Verlick's men are inside these walls. And the only thing standing between this kingdom and a civil war that will burn every village north of the Coldwater River is the decision you make in the next 5 minutes. He stopped. He did not issue an order. He did not threaten consequences. He stood in the barracks of his own fortress and waited for the answer to a question he had never asked before in his life. Not whether they feared him enough to obey, but whether there was anything underneath the fear that was worth building on. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Kedrick counted them the way he counted everything, precisely, automatically, with the detached awareness that each second carried the weight of a potential outcome that would determine whether the next 30 years of his life were spent rebuilding a kingdom or rotting in Verlick's prison. A soldier in the front row stood up. Young, square-jawed, the kind of face that had not yet learned to hide what it felt. Orders, Your Grace. One by one, they stood. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic unison of a theatrical moment designed for maximum emotional impact. In the halting, uncoordinated, deeply human way that real decisions happened, one man at a time, each one measuring the cost against the conviction and finding the conviction heavier. 41 of the 43 stood. 2 remained seated. Kedrick looked at them without judgment. Fear was not a moral failure. It was a survival response, and a man who had built his entire empire on exploiting it had no right to condemn anyone for feeling it. Stay in the barracks, he told the 2. No one will touch you. When this is over, you go home with full wages. He turned to the 41. Seal the gates. Secure the armory. Find Aldrich. They found him in Kedrick's own study. The steward was sitting behind the Duke's desk with a glass of the Duke's whiskey and a stack of the Duke's correspondence spread across the surface, like a man conducting an inventory of property he expected to inherit. When the door opened and Kedrick walked in, flanked by Brannock and 6 garrison soldiers, Aldrich's hand stopped halfway to the glass and held there, frozen in a gesture that would have been unremarkable in any other context, but in this one looked exactly like a man caught in the middle of an act he had believed would never be witnessed. The moment lasted 3 seconds. Then Aldrich set his hand down, leaned back in the chair, and looked at Kedrick with an expression that combined resignation and something uncomfortably close to professional respect. The passage beneath the east cliff, Aldrich said. I always suspected it existed. I could never find it. That was the point. Yes, I suppose it was. Aldrich glanced at the soldiers flanking the door, at Brannock, whose pale eyes held steady on him with the flat intensity of a man who had waited 15 years to see the system that destroyed his career produce a consequence for someone other than the innocent. How much do you know? Everything. Kedrick crossed the room and stopped in front of his own desk, looking down at the man who had occupied it. 9 years. Verlick's primary intelligence channel. Financial leverage as the initial mechanism, converted to ideological alignment over time. You were not just reporting to him. You were helping him build the architecture of a conspiracy designed to collapse the northern territories and consume the crown. Aldrich's face did not change. The composure was genuine, not performance, not bravado, but the settled calm of a man who had been living inside a lie for so long that the removal of the lie felt more like relief than catastrophe. Financial leverage is a generous description, Aldrich said quietly. Verlick owned my family's debt, my sister's medical costs, my brother's release from a debtor's prison that should not have existed in a kingdom that claims to value justice. He did not recruit me through ideology. He recruited me through the specific cruelty of a system that destroys ordinary people while protecting the powerful. He paused. A system you maintained, Your Grace, with enthusiastic precision. The words landed. Kaedric let them land. He did not deflect. He did not counter-argue. He stood in front of the man who had betrayed him for 9 years and absorbed the accusation with the full understanding that it was accurate. The system that created Aldrich's vulnerability was the same system Kaedric had inherited and perfected and never once examined, because examining it would have meant questioning the foundation of everything he stood on. "You are right," Kaedric said. Aldrich blinked. It was the first time in 14 years that the steward's composure cracked, and the crack was small, a fractional widening of the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, but it was real. "I built a kingdom on fear and called it governance," Kaedric continued. "I maintained a system that crushed ordinary people and called it order. I stood on a balcony and watched an innocent man die because questioning the verdict would have been inconvenient, and I called that strength." His voice was steady, but it was not controlled, not in the way it had always been controlled. It was steady the way a man's voice was steady when he had stopped performing and started speaking. "You betrayed me. That is a fact. But the system that made your betrayal possible is one I maintained with every decision I have made since I inherited this title. That is also a fact." The study was silent. The soldiers at the door stood motionless. Brannick leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching the exchange with the expression of a man witnessing something he had not believed was possible, and Arden Moore admitting fault without qualification. "What happens now?" Aldrich said. "You stand trial. Not Verlick's version of justice and not mine. A real trial, with evidence and testimony, and a proceeding that does not begin with the verdict already written." Kaedric straightened. "And your family's debts are cleared. Your sister's care continues. Your brother stays free. Those are not bargaining terms. Those are corrections to a system that should never have put you in a position where betrayal was the most rational option available." Aldrich stared at him for a long time. Whatever he saw in the Duke's face produced a reaction that moved through his body like a tremor. Small, deep, originating from somewhere that 14 years of professional composure had not been able to fully anesthetize. "She changed you," Aldrich said. "She showed me what was already there, buried under the architecture." They took Aldrich into custody without violence. The remaining Verlick operatives inside the keep, 11 men who had infiltrated the garrison under Aldrich's authorization, were identified and detained by soldiers who had spent weeks watching strangers walk through their fortress and had catalogued every face, every patrol deviation, every subtle wrong note in the daily rhythm of Blackthorn without having anyone to report it to until now. By dawn, the fortress was secured. By midday, ravens carrying Kaedric's sealed communications were flying south toward every allied house that had not yet committed to Verlick's coalition. By evening, the first responses arrived, cautious, skeptical, but present. The narrative was shifting, not because Kaedric had deployed force or leverage or the familiar instruments of fear that had defined Ardenmoor diplomacy for generations, because the truth was moving through the kingdom's political network with the unstoppable momentum of something that had been suppressed too long and finally found a crack wide enough to escape through. Serafina reached the capital on the 4th day, exactly as planned. General Castaigne reviewed the evidence, verified the documentation, and dispatched the King's Guard to arrest Cassian Verlick before sunset. The conspiracy collapsed from the center outward. Each compromised advisor, each purchased military commander, each corrupted trade official folding under the weight of evidence that Edric Vale had gathered at the cost of his life, and his daughter had carried through a blizzard at the cost of everything except her refusal to stop moving forward. Verlick was taken alive. He did not resist. According to the reports that reached Blackthorn a week later, he sat in his study and drank wine while the guards approached, and when they entered, he looked at the lead officer and said, "I always knew it would be the daughter." Then he set down his glass and held out his wrists and said nothing else. The trial took 6 weeks. Kadrick attended every session. He sat in the gallery of the capital's tribunal hall and listened to testimony that disassembled the conspiracy with surgical precision, each witness adding another structural element to the case until the complete architecture of Verlick's network was visible to the entire kingdom. Every bribe, every fabricated charge, every manipulated intelligence report, every innocent life sacrificed to maintain a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of men who believed they were entitled to it. Edric Vale's name was cleared on the 37th day. Serafina was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Kadrick found her later, standing on a terrace outside the tribunal building, looking out over the capital's skyline, with her hands resting on the stone railing and her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who had just received something she had been fighting for so long that the absence of the fight felt more disorienting than the fight itself. He stood beside her without speaking. The capital spread below them in a sprawl of rooftops and chimney smoke and the distant glitter of the river cutting through the city's center. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, and the late afternoon light turned everything warm in a way that felt improbable after so many days of winter. "It is done," she said. "It is done. My father's name, officially, on the record. The kingdom knows he was innocent. The kingdom knows." She turned to him. The light caught the amber in her eyes and turned it luminous, and he thought about the first night she had walked into Blackthorn's great hall, wearing silver velvet with frost on her hem, and how she had looked at him with assessment instead of fear, and how that single act of refusal had set in motion a chain of events that demolished everything he thought he was and rebuilt it into something he did not yet fully recognize but was no longer afraid to examine. "What happens to Blackthorn?" she said. "Blackthorn stands. It has always stood. The walls do not care who governs them." "That is not what I asked." "I know what you asked." She waited. The wind moved across the terrace and carried the sounds of the capital upward, distant voices, cartwheels on cobblestone, the ordinary noise of a kingdom that was absorbing the shock of its own corruption and beginning the slow, unglamorous work of continuing to exist. "I am going back," Kadrick said. "The northern territories need governance that is not built on fear. The border villages need grain and infrastructure and a tax system that does not punish people for being poor. The garrison needs a command structure that values conscience over obedience." He paused. "I need to become a different kind of ruler, not the kind my father built, not the kind Verlick exploited, something I do not have a blueprint for yet." "That sounds terrifying." "It is." "Good." She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts challenge and something warmer, something that lived in the space between what they had survived together and what they had not yet said to each other. Terrified men make better decisions than confident ones. Confident men build vaults and lock children inside them and call it education. Terrified men ask for help. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, a fracture in the controlled surface that let something through, something human, something that had been waiting behind the architecture for 25 years. "Come back to Blackthorn," he said. "As what?" "As yourself. Not a hostage, not a political arrangement, not a bride acquired through a royal decree written by men who thought your value was measured in territory and bloodline." He held her gaze. "As the woman who walked into my hall and refused to kneel and somehow convinced the most heavily fortified man in the kingdom to open a door he did not know existed. That is not a title." "No, it is better than a title. Titles are given by men with authority. This is something I am asking for, and I have been told that asking is the one thing I was never supposed to be capable of." Serafina studied him the way she had studied him from the first moment, with that precise, penetrating assessment that saw through every layer of armor and strategy and performance to the raw material underneath. But this time, for the first time, what she found beneath the surface was not hidden. It was standing in front of her, unarmored, uncontrolled, visible. "You're going to be a terrible duke," she said. For at least the first year, possibly longer. You have the instincts of a tyrant and the emotional vocabulary of a man who learned feelings from a textbook written in a dead language. Noted. And I'm going to argue with you constantly about policy, about justice, about every decision you make that prioritizes control over compassion. Because the difference between the man you were and the man you are trying to become is not a destination. It is a daily choice, and some days you will choose wrong. And on those days, I will be standing in your study telling you so in terms that will make your captains extremely uncomfortable. Also noted. And I will never kneel. He looked at her standing on the terrace with the capital at her back and the late afternoon light turning her into something that belonged to no category he had ever constructed. Not hostage, not bride, not political instrument, but a woman who had walked through every door he locked and every wall he built, and every defense he constructed, and arrived at the center of him carrying nothing but the truth and the absolute refusal to pretend it was not enough. I never wanted you to, he said, and there on the terrace, with the kingdom reshaping itself around the wreckage of a conspiracy and the slow, painful work of becoming something better than what it had been, Caedric Ardenmore did something his father would not have recognized and his enemies would not have believed, and his own reflection would have mocked 6 months ago. He reached for her hand, not with the possessive grip of a man claiming territory, with the open palm of a man offering something he had never offered anyone, the one gesture that required more courage than any military campaign or political negotiation or calculated act of dominance he had ever performed. He offered vulnerability, and he waited to see if she would take it. Serafina looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. Then she placed her palm against his, and her fingers closed around his with a pressure that was not gentle, and was not aggressive, and was not anything except the specific, deliberate grip of a woman who had decided that the man standing in front of her was worth the risk of believing he could change. They stood like that for a long time. The wind carried the sounds of the capital past them, and the light moved across the terrace in the slow rotation of a world that did not stop for human decisions, no matter how significant. Below them, the kingdom continued. Markets opened, children played, guards walked their routes, and merchants counted their coins, and ordinary people lived ordinary lives inside a system that was broken and being rebuilt, and would probably never be perfect, but might, with enough stubborn effort from enough imperfect people, become something closer to just. They returned to Blackthorn 3 weeks later. The keep looked the same from the outside. Obsidian walls, iron spires, narrow windows set deep into stone faces designed for war. The architecture had not changed, but the way people moved inside it had. Servants spoke in the corridors. The kitchens were loud with conversation during meal preparation. The garrison trained in the yard with an energy that had shifted from the mechanical precision of frightened men to the engaged discipline of soldiers who understood why they were doing what they were doing instead of simply understanding what would happen if they stopped. Caedric governed differently. Not perfectly, not consistently. Some mornings the old instinct surged, the reflex to control, to dominate, to crush uncertainty before it could metastasize into vulnerability. On those mornings he stood at the window of his study and pressed his hand against the cold glass and breathed until the impulse passed. And sometimes it passed quickly, and sometimes it did not. And on the days it did not, he found Serafina in the library, or the kitchens, or the courtyard, and told her the truth about what he was feeling, which was the hardest thing he did on any given day and the most important. Brannock accepted a formal appointment as military advisor. He moved into quarters at Blackthorn with the resigned pragmatism of a man who had learned that the world's sense of irony was more persistent than his own sense of grievance. He argued with Caedric constantly about strategy, about garrison management, about the Duke's persistent instinct to solve problems through intimidation rather than dialogue. The arguments were loud and profane and occasionally resulted in furniture being struck, and they were the healthiest professional relationship either man had ever experienced. The Northern Territories changed slowly, not with the dramatic speed of a political revolution, but with the grinding, incremental pace of actual reform, tax structures revised, border villages supplied, a judicial system rebuilt from the foundation with the radical premise that justice should not be determined by the defendant's proximity to power. It was unglamorous work. It produced no speeches, it generated no legends. It was the kind of governance that history rarely remembered because it was too quiet to compete with the drama of what came before. But the villages remembered. The merchants remembered. The soldiers and servants and ordinary citizens who had spent their lives navigating a system designed to exploit them remembered. And what they remembered was not the terrifying duke who had ruled through fear, but the imperfect, struggling, frequently irritable man who had torn down his own fortress from the inside and tried to build something human in its place. And on the nights when Blackthorn was quiet and the sea below the cliffs had settled into something closer to a murmur than a roar, Cadric sat in his study with the maps and the correspondence and the endless architectural work of governing a territory that was learning to exist without terror as its primary building material, and he thought about the vault. Not with the old reflexive flinch, not with the hardened acceptance he had carried for 25 years, like a scar he had learned to treat as armor. He thought about it the way a man thought about a place he had survived, with clear eyes and a steady pulse, and the understanding that survival was not the end of the story. It was only the part where the real work began. The door to his study opened. Serafina entered carrying 2 cups of something warm, set one on his desk, and took the chair opposite him without asking if it was occupied, because she had never asked permission for anything inside Blackthorn, and he had long since stopped expecting her to. "The grain reports from the eastern provinces," she said. "Mercer's replacement is competent. The winter stores are at 90% capacity. No starvation projections for the first time in 6 years." "Good. And Brannock says your new captain needs remedial training in conflict resolution because he threatened to flog a courier for delivering bad news." "I will handle it." "You will handle it by talking to him, not by threatening to flog him for threatening to flog someone else." "That was going to be my second approach." She looked at him across the desk. The lamplight moved across her face the way it had moved across her face 100 times in this room, in this chair, in the particular configuration of 2 people who had found each other inside the wreckage of a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of finding. "Your father would not recognize this place," she said. "My father would not recognize me." "Is that a loss?" Cadric considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. His father, the vault. The darkness that had shaped him into a weapon so effective he had forgotten he was also a man. The lessons that had kept him alive and kept him powerful and kept him utterly, systematically alone inside a fortress full of people who obeyed him because the alternative was destruction. "No," he said, "it is not a loss." And outside, the northern wind moved across the cliffs of Blackthorn and met the sea in the ancient collision that had been happening since before the fortress was built, and would continue long after every duke and every conspiracy and every political system had dissolved into the sediment of history. And the sound it made was not gentle and was not kind, but it was honest. The way all things that survived long enough eventually became honest. And inside the keep the lights burned warm against the obsidian walls, and the people inside them moved without fear, and the most dangerous man in Valadorn sat across a desk from the woman who had refused to kneel and discovered, in the quiet accumulation of ordinary evenings, that the strongest thing he had ever built was not a fortress at all. It was the willingness to let someone see what was inside it,